Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the book.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on November 17th, 2023 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to remind you that a new podcast drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, and that you can find on the karmicevolution.com website under the banner heading of podcast, recent, and you can find the live podcast if you choose to listen at that sign, or you can find the recording, and you can also find recordings of past podcast. So if you've missed any and you'd like to catch up, you can certainly go there. You'll also see the How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy free download PDF, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. So be sure to grab that when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some words of astrological wisdom. Separately, if you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, I'm offering a 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for the discounted amount of only $125. And that discount is for podcast listeners only. The normal rate for a reading is $180. So it's a nice discount if you are looking for clarity about why you're here, what's your soul's major purpose and mission in this lifetime, as well as what might be holding you back from achieving this and as part, if not all, of your highest destiny in this lifetime. So this reading will reveal to you how the energies into which your soul chose to be born may be holding you back now by keeping you stuck in old soul-conditioned habits or early life patterns, and understanding that it's such conditioned behavior is a way to assist yourself to make different, more positive changes in the future, especially in the areas of greatest interest, which for some of us is relationships, other is more about careers and jobs, and still others, it's about finances and or our health. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, this reading is the one for you. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been either so easy or so affordable when you take advantage of this special discounted offer, which you can find at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. And in addition, I wanted to let everybody know that I'm giving a webinar lecture for the North Jersey NCGR Astrology Group on December 3rd. And the title of that lecture is Discover Your Inner Intuitive. Learn how to locate and enhance your intuitive psychic gifts and aptitudes in your astrological birth chart. You know, we're all intuitive, at least to a certain degree, but often we need validation to allow ourselves to actually believe this. So validating and expanding our intuitive capabilities helps us enhance our creativity, aids us in making decisions that we know intuitively are right for us, and increases our potential for future happiness. So in this talk, I'm going to explore how to decipher precisely what grants an individual his or her intuitive and or psychic capabilities as defined by identifying planets, signs, house locations, and aspects that pinpoint the specific nature of such aptitudes. So we'll look at what might block also these natural intuitive capabilities that we might have in the form of astrological placements that cause doubt, which can, make us range from an over-reliance on the logical, empirical, rational world, all the way to simple fear that what we don't understand might harm us. So if you're interested in joining me for this enlightening discussion, which again will take place on Sunday, December 3rd from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, simply go to the North Jersey NCGR Facebook page and click the link to sign up. The fee for the webinar is $15, and I would say bring your birth chart and be prepared to learn some interesting stuff about what helps us all rely not only on, as I said, our logical, rational mind, but on our intuition as well, to see our intuitive capabilities, which some of us have more in the range of psychic capabilities, as gifts and aptitudes rather than as problems or things, as I said, to be feared. Okay, so now let's get into this week's Astro News you can use. And let's note what's been happening since Venus moved into its own sign of Libra on November 7th, and Mercury ingressed into Sagittarius on November 9th and 10th, depending on your time zone. As we know, the Venus-ruled airy Libra archetype is about balance, fairness, justice, negotiation, compromise, and harmonious relationships, while fiery, expansive, exaggerative, and potentially hyperbolic Jupiter-ruled Sagittarius archetypally represents increased attention to issues around foreigners, travel, immigration, trade, law, higher education, moral philosophy, or philosophy and morals, I should say, and or religion. So Venus in Libra, where she'll remain until December 4th, represents the ability to negotiate and compromise, a peaceful solution, even if only a temporary one. And Mercury in Sagittarius expands our communicative ability to discuss the bigger picture as related to any of the topics just listed, and of course to make major announcements. And since we'll see the Sun-Mars conjunction in Scorpio perfect either later today or early tomorrow morning, again, depending on your own time zone, at 25 degrees and 38 minutes of Scorpio, such announcements may have to do with trust, power, money, sexuality, and the use or abuse of any of the above. So if we look back first to the now waxing November 13th Scorpio new moon's energies, we can note that this lunation was concerned with being able to plant new seeds of self-empowerment through increasing trust in oneself. So with Venus in Libra, this is to be done through negotiated compromise in our partnerships, and with Mercury in Sag through the expansion of communication, leading to a greater understanding of the bigger picture within our partnerships. So the fact that this lunation included an opposition to Uranus, which is still currently retrograde in Taurus, and which required us to continue to rethink our true values, especially about issues related to Pluto-ruled Scorpio archetypes, such as the ones mentioned, but also put another way, trust, joint resources and other people's money, sexual bonding, birth, death, and the need to adapt and evolve into a rebirth, we knew that we were in store for some surprises, perhaps of the outside of the box kind. And so perhaps it's no surprise that as we approach November 20th, first quarter lunar square, that the U.S. President Joe Biden, that his meeting with China's Xi Jinping on November 15th, as Mercury's sextile to Venus provided opportunities for love and friendship that day, resulted in an agreement to keep the lines of communication open between the two leaders to prevent any future miscommunication, particularly during times of crisis. And this was especially important given that the two leaders haven't communicated directly for at least the past year. And further, in addition to agreeing to improve their future communication, this meeting led also to tackling issues related to climate change and reducing China's opioid production, as again, both Mars and the Sun in Scorpio are waxing toward today's exact trines in Neptune and Pisces. So don't forget, Neptune's the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion, all of which amount to escapist tendencies through the use of mind-altering substances, in part, such as drugs and alcohol. And Biden and Xi found room for cooperation, according to the New York Times on November 16th, which added, the leaders agreed to restart military communications that were suspended last year after Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan. Biden said they had made progress on curbing Chinese production of the opioid fentanyl, and both sides issued positive statements trumpeting where they found common ground. However, as Mercury in Sagittarius and Venus in Libra waxed quincunx to Jupiter retrograde in Taurus on November 15th and 16th, it was clear that further adjustment would still be needed, as the New York Times explained, and I quote, but there was plenty they didn't agree upon. Xi complained that U.S. export controls on advanced technologies such as semiconductors were intended to suppress China. Biden's effort to enlist Beijing as a kind of peacekeeper in the Middle East, specifically putting pressure on Iran to not escalate the Israel-Hamas war, was unsuccessful. And the two sides didn't make much progress on systems to ban the use of artificial intelligence to manage their nuclear arsenals, agreeing only that their officials would keep talking. End quote. So clearly there's room for adjustment still on many issues. However, this was the first positive step toward reestablishing the lines of communication during Venus in Libra and Mercury in Sadge, as noted. Likewise, we saw the U.S. Congress dodge a short-term disaster as both houses passed a continuing resolution on November 15th, again, as we were waxing toward today's exact Sun-Mars conjunction in Scorpio. According to the New York Times, this, quote, sets up two deadlines in early 2024, with money for some agencies running out on January 19th and the rest on February 2nd. It continues funding at current levels and contains no policy conditions, two aspects that please Democrats and enraged far-right Republicans who have demanded steep cuts and conservative policy requirements. And President Biden has said he will sign it, which he probably will have done by the time this podcast airs on November 17th, which is the deadline date for a government shutdown without a budget resolution. Now, though unaware of the quincunxes on the day of its passage, the New York Times continued, and here I quote again, Congress will have only a few months to reach a government-wide spending agreement, and a Republican mutiny over the measure on the House floor on Wednesday reflected how difficult it will be for the GOP leaders to come to terms with Democrats on a more lasting plan. End quote. Note the Venus in Libra, a negotiated compromise agreement, and Mercury in Sagittarius, important announcement, their influences, as Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced yesterday, quote, "This Friday night there will be no government shutdown. Because of bipartisan cooperation, we are keeping the government open without any poison pills or harmful cuts to vital programs. A great outcome for the American people," end quote. Note, too, however, that the Mercury and Venus quincunxes to Jupiter, which represents the law, right, require that adjustments to this agreement still be made, only we've kicked the can down the road to avoid an imminent catastrophe. And this is another quote. The tight timeline and the upcoming holidays leave lawmakers little breathing room to resolve the substantial differences between the two chambers and also among House Republicans. The internal GOP rifts were on display yet again on Wednesday, and that was the day that both the House and the Senate passed these bills, when rank-and-file Republicans blocked a separate spending bill from being considered. This is a quote from the New York Times still. Protesting Speaker Mike Johnson's move a day earlier to rely on Democrats to push through the stopgap spending legislation, members of the House Freedom Caucus joined with Democrats to prevent legislation funding the Commerce and Justice Departments and science agencies from coming to the floor. The mutiny prompted leaders to adjourn the House abruptly and send lawmakers home for Thanksgiving. So, I'm sorry, this must have happened, this was on the November 15th, which was Wednesday, because the House passed their bill during the day, and then that evening the Senate passed their bill. And then I think they tried to pass another spending bill after that, and that's when they adjourned for, they adjourned a week earlier than the rest of us for Thanksgiving. Anyway, the article goes on. It was the latest failure on spending bills, and I believe there's 12 separate spending bills that the House has not been successful on and at passing even one of them that are necessary now that this continuing resolution is in effect to make sure that we have budget resolutions, not continuing resolutions, but final budget resolutions by the deadlines announced in January and February. So the Times goes on to say that it was the latest failure of spending bills under Mr. Johnson, and it reflected the ire of hardline House Republicans that the temporary funding measure omitted their priorities. End quote. So I'm saying that it's interesting to note that Mike Johnson, who I've talked about before on this podcast, who was born on January 30th, 1972 in Shreveport, Louisiana, had the Scorpio new moon quincunx to his natal Mars in Aries. Now, although we have no birth time for him, we know that his moon is in Sagittarius. He is a lawyer during the 24-hour period on the day of his birth, and that his moon may, depending on its exact degree, trine his Mars, but we don't know that for sure. And that's usually a pretty lucky aspect. However, regardless, we can see that he was forced to do the same thing that got previous GOP Majority Leader and Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy ousted from his position. And that was that McCarthy negotiated with Democrats to obtain the original continuing resolution that avoided a government shutdown back on September 29. So the question still remains, will Johnson be able to keep his Speaker position over the long term? I looked back at his chart again because I know I'd said a couple things about him last week or the week before and noted he's a Pluto in Libra, and his Pluto in Libra trines his Aquarius North Node and his Aquarius Sun and sextiles his Leo South Node. So now transiting Pluto in Capricorn, which is direct, has been trining his Saturn at 28 degrees and 34 minutes of Taurus. That's an Earth trine. And when transiting Pluto moves into Aquarius again, it will exact trine his natal Pluto. So all of this bodes well for him now, but given that he's got a natal out-of-sign square from that 28 degree 34 minute Taurus Saturn to his 1 degree 51 minute Pluto in Libra, and a wide opposition from his Mars at 22 151 Aries to that same Pluto at 151 Libra, there's a T-square there that may be set into motion by today's new Sun-Mars cycle in Scorpio. So clearly the GOP Freedom Caucus, instrumental in McCarthy's exit as Speaker, is displeased now with Johnson too, which is what I just mentioned. So bear in mind that transiting Mars will exact oppose Johnson's Saturn on November 22nd and exact square his Pluto on November 27th, as transiting Pluto's conjoined also to his natal Mercury in Capricorn then. And this seems to me like a surefire kind of indication that there's going to be a lot of frustration on his part. And I think it remains to be seen exactly how that will play out. But again, an adjustment, that's the quincunx, may be the answer, as transiting Saturn begins to move into a quincunx to his natal Pluto then too. So we shall see, but altogether it doesn't look like particularly enjoyable energy now. I mean, I'm guessing that, these guys and gals have gone home, but that doesn't mean that some of them aren't going to continue to have conversations or express their opinions, pro or con. And since it's clear that Johnson's an ideologue, given his Aquarius sun's identity with his fixed, conservative, religiously inspired, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ long-term stances or philosophies, I'd wonder if that Pluto on his Mercury in Cap might rigidly defy pressure from the even righter wing of his party when it comes to making bipartisan deals with Democrats who they perceive as quote-unquote the enemy. So, in other words, it's like, Scorpio is other people's money, as I said, right? And it's the taxpayers' money that funds, or monies that fund the government. So being against certain things that might fund, say, abortions, or being against LGBTQ, transgender treatments, and things of that nature is not so much what we're talking about, because those represent a small part of the picture of the overall budget of the U.S. So whether Johnson is ideologically for suppressing funds for some of those things that are included in more minor ways by denying funding for everything, it remains to be seen. But I think that is where some of the where some of this conflict for him may come up, because it's sort of like, well, are you with us or against us? And if you're against us, then why are you doing bipartisan deals? And on that score, too, we have the Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville, who I also mentioned last week, and the growing Sun-Mars energy, conjunction energy around the Senate's finding a way around his refusal to allow any military positions to be voted on and fulfilled, or I should say any vacant military positions, based on his objection to the military allowing enlisted women to travel for abortions to states where it remains legal. And the handwriting seems to be on the wall there, too. So here's hoping the Senate takes appropriate action, as there's more than 300 military positions in need of being filled, and the Senate's the only one that can do it. And, even the more conservative, some right-wing senators are getting exasperated with Tuberville because they feel we need a strong military. So, I'd say that that's in part because organization and structure are nowhere more important than in places like the military, and taking action to make progress towards filling these positions is gaining traction now as Saturn, transiting Saturn, begins to ramp up his speed since his November 4th station direct in Pisces. And I think it's also, speaking of Saturn in Pisces, I noticed this interesting symbolic representation those who've been listening to this show regularly know that I talk about Saturn and Pisces as the water rising against the dam, or walls or blockages. And so again, we have a symbolic representation through the impeding of the flow of people from exercising their free will. And this comes from the New York Times on November 14th, and the headline reads, "Border Wall Falls Leave Migrants with Devastating and Costly Injuries." Hundreds of migrants, this article says, have ended up needing extensive treatment in U.S. hospitals after trying to scale barriers along the southern border. Ambulances rush them daily to hospitals in El Paso, San Diego, and Tucson, Arizona, writhing in pain. Bones poking out of arms and legs, skulls cracked, spines shattered. The men and women arrive on stretchers, flanked by an agent in the telltale green uniform of the U.S. Border Patrol. The article continues, "One look and I know it's another wall fall," said Brian Elmore, an emergency medicine physician at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center in El Paso. The patients are all migrants who have crashed to the ground while trying to climb over the wall that separates Mexico and the United States for long stretches of the border. End quote. I believe it's interesting at this point also to note, especially since the Scorpio new moon on November 13th was opposite Uranus, and that this illuminated for us all both the symbolism and the actual word hostage. So obviously we've been hearing this word a lot since October 7th, when Hamas terrorists invaded Israel, killed 1,200 people and took captives, up to 240 captives, and how Palestinians say they've been held hostage by Israel for years. So it's not that, the world wasn't paying attention to the Palestinians using that word, but this new moon and events have heightened the fact that both sides will use this word, and we're not getting, again, into a political discussion here. This is just an observation of fact. And scapegoating can be a scorpionic energy where two parties mirror it back and forth. And then there's the more general topic of the GOP being held hostage to Trump, by the courts being held hostage to Trump, etc. So now I want to delve a little bit more into this Sun, Mars, and Scorpio conjunction today, which represents a new synodic cycle. And that simply means that we're at the beginning now of a new 2.2-year cycle, which is how long it takes for Mars to revolve entirely around the Sun. And I found it interesting that astrologer Robert Wilkinson had this take about this conjunction on his blog, so I thought I'd share it with everyone. And this is a quote from his blog. "We're now approaching Sun conjunct Mars. It began when the Sun entered Scorpio on October 23rd and has gotten stronger since then, with Mars bringing initial energy, followed by the Sun's illuminating vitality. Once they conjunct on November 17th and 18th at 2538 Scorpio, we'll be in a new Sun-Mars cycle affecting wherever it falls in our chart." So those of you who know your chart, you want to look at the house. "When the Sun and Mars join up in one of our sectors, some powerful events can happen. This now finishes the old Sun-Mars cycle, which began in October 2021 with the Sun and Mars at 16 Libra, showing the past 2 years have been focused on some form of," and this is, I'm still quoting from him, "repair and or reconstruction, with a need to be joyous as we needed construction work to fix something which had previously been wrecked by storms. We hit the midpoint of that cycle in early December of 2022, when the Sun at 17 Gemini opposed Mars at 17 Sagittarius. We're now finished with the old cycle and preparing for a new one. Because both the Sun and Mars provide power to move things forward at a brisk pace, be a little cautious in your use of power these next few weeks. As the Sun represents vitality and illumination, and Mars represents energy and blunt force, find a measure of self-restraint as you consider other angles of approach with an eye to efficient adaptation and being at home in any circumstance. This conjunction is important in yet another way, Wilkinson continues, since after today's Sun-Mars conjunction, Mars will be the planet, quote, leading the light, showing it's the entryway to finding the illumination in any experience. By November 24th, when the Sun moves into Sagittarius, even though they're still very close, the conjunction will no longer be exact and will begin a time when the Sun illuminates the way for Mars' direct action after the Sun vitalizes whatever it is shining on. As the conjunction accompanies a trine to Neptune and a sextile to Pluto, the next 2-year cycles will be very favorable from a spiritual angle. And that's the end of the quote. So that the Scorpio new moon's opposition to Uranus on November 13th triggered some surprises, especially, as I've noted, those about money and partnerships. Let's not forget that not all is rosy. Again, since, things like the budget, the continuing resolution in Congress is only a temporary solution to our future budget issues, and that it also, given that Sun-Mars can have a warlike quality too, didn't include any funding for the current war in Ukraine and or financial assistance to Israel. And so these are likely to be part of the future. But what I also do believe was unleashed at this new moon, given that the Sun was waxing towards its conjunction with Mars and Scorpio then, that, as I just discussed, will be in effect for the next two years, 2 months roughly. We had the unbelievably vitriolic and violent rhetoric from former President Donald Trump. This all made headlines, so I don't think I need to repeat what he said, other than the fact that he used the same hyperbolic language, Mercury and Sadge, remember, as Hitler and Mussolini, that called anyone opposing him vermin, who needs to be rooted out to keep the blood of Americans pure. And, this is all echoes, obviously, of fascist rhetoric from World War II. It's quite remarkable that this occurred just before today's Sun-Mars new cycle begins. That it occurred then, it tells me that we're in for a time of proactive evolution, yes, but also when combined with the fact that Pluto's heading back to re-enter Aquarius from January 20th, 2024. Yeah, that's next year, but it's coming up soon enough, through September 2nd of 2024, which is coincidentally the same day that Uranus will station retrograde again in late Taurus, and that Pluto will then retrograde back into Capricorn until entering Aquarius again for the next solid 20 years on November 19th of 2024. And I believe, as we've been seeing, and as I mentioned last week with Mercury's entrance into Sagittarius, illuminating issues around free speech in general, but particularly in Sagittarius-themed institutions of higher learning, such as colleges and university campuses, that this will continue given the new Sun-Mars cycle, combined with the ingress of Pluto into Aquarius. So if we think of it this way, the Sun-Mars cycle, because it's in Scorpio, which in addition to social evolution, involves also bringing to the surface all things taboo, will manifest both on the side of expressing things some believe should not be expressed, and then combated through controlling that expression. And here I note also what I mentioned at least 2 podcasts ago, which is the rescinding of law school students' job offers by major law firms based on their decision to take a pro-Palestinian stand against the current Israel-Hamas conflict that's now taken the lives of more than 10,000 Gazans, nearly half of them women and children. So the fixity of Scorpio in terms of control can be seen in both Donald Trump's fascist rhetoric, as he desires to regain the White House in 2024, so that he can impose martial law, enact the Insurrection Act, and use an army he's reportedly currently been attempting to build through dissidents in the U.S. military and others inside of what we now are more familiar with the term, the administrative state of civil servants, government, federal government employees, with the help of the right-wing Heritage and Cates foundations, to gain and remain in power in perpetuity. Some have even speculated that means a new autocratic form of government if he successfully regains the White House, would eliminate future elections, and the power would simply be passed to his heirs. And anyone who wants to even contemplate that for just a moment, the horror. So, Don Jr., Eric, Ivanka, she would be somewhat acceptable, but she's still part of the group, So anyway, as far-fetched as that may seem, my mention of this building of a military, insurrection or whatever, it has been documented in mainstream media this past week. So a quick Google search will bring up the details, and it's based on factual reporting and things that Trump has said himself, things that his representatives have said, things that have been posted on his Truth Social site. So feel free to check it out should you have any doubts about these reports' veracity. Oh, by the way, it's interesting to note, and I left this out, but now that I'm on the subject, I want to include it. Truth Social apparently is on the verge of financial bankruptcy. And I don't have the details in front of me, but it was funded by a SPAC, and I've forgotten, some of you will know what that stands for, but there's financial trouble afoot, and they need to get commitments for continued funding in order for them to stay afloat. So keep your eye on that, because if that goes down, that might be a bellwether for a symbolic bellwether for some other things coming to or involving social media platforms and free speech, etc., etc. So now, with Pluto wavering back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn, which began on March 23rd, 2023, and which I noted then had its roots, I felt, the energy that was to come had its roots in Saturn's transit through Aquarius, Pluto in Capricorn, Saturn, you're moving into Aquarius, Saturn, which rules Capricorn, moving through Aquarius, and it's retrograde back into Capricorn, and that happened between March 22nd, 2020 and March 7th of 2023. I believe, and I said this way back when, I think in March, or even before that, I don't know, that when Pluto entered Aquarius and went back and forth through his retrograde periods to Capricorn, we would see an echo of that time. So while Saturn was in Aquarius and Capricorn during that period mentioned, we had the Black Lives Matter protests, the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, as well as the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, among other events. And it seems, looking back now, as if we might discern that the former brought a lot of young people and marginalized groups out onto the streets to peacefully protest the Black Lives Matter cause and, again, the murder of George Floyd, from which it sprang, while the Capitol riot drew some young, yes, but many older people who took violent action against the Capitol Police. Now we're seeing a kind of return to the era of the mid to late 1960s, when Uranus conjoined with Pluto and Leo. And I believe that Pluto entering the sign ruled by Uranus represents now again an echo of that time. And at that time, of course, we had the protests of the young people, many of which took place on college and university campuses. Remember Kent State and things like that, where the National Guard shot to death a young woman. I'm sorry, shot to death in Kent State. Was it one woman or four? It was four people, I think. All right, I'm sorry. I don't have that in front of me, but I do remember, I'm thinking I was reading a whole article a while back, like a year ago or more, about the one gal who was only 15 years old and a homeless teenager who just happened to be on the campus at that time and joined some of the protests. But again, I think that Pluto going to Aquarius echoes the conjunction from the mid-60s, as well as the more recent Saturn journey through Uranus ruled Aquarius, which was a highly revolutionary time in terms of people taking to the streets. And also, it represents the period when Uranus, which was then in Aries, squared Pluto and Capricorn, and that happened between 2011 and 2016. So if we go back to this past week and the upcoming Scorpio new moon's waxing first quarter square of the Aquarius moon to the Scorpio sun on November 20th, the same day that the sun will sextile Scorpio's ruler Pluto, now direct in Capricorn, while Mercury in Sadge will trine wounded healer Chiron. And given that this is followed on November 21st by Mars in Scorpio's sextile to Pluto in Capricorn, we may well have a recipe for pushing through any resistance to developing a greater sense of self-empowerment between now and then. And according to Stephen Farr's website, I was going to give you all the dates of the conjunctions, not the conjunctions, the squares between Uranus and Pluto from 2012 to 2015. But I want to point out that he noted that before the first exact square, which was on June 24th of 2012, we had the July 5th, 2010 Uranus station at 035 Aries with Pluto at 3 degrees 52 Capricorn, and on July 9th of 2011, approximately a year later, Uranus stationed at 4 degrees 34 minutes of Aries, and Pluto was at 5 minutes and 54 5 degrees and 54 minutes of Capricorn. His point was that they came very close before they actually squared each other. They came very close in 2010, a year later in 2011, and then exact squared themselves almost a year later in June of 2012. So I just wanted to point out that it was interesting to note that between July 5th of 2010 and July 9th of 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its Citizen United decision, the one allowing dark money to anonymously fund political campaigns. And according to the Britannica website, and I quote here, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, case in which the U.S. Supreme Court on January 21st, 2010 ruled 5-4 that laws that prevented corporations and unions from using their general treasury funds for independent, quote, electioneering communications, and in parentheses, political advertising, violated the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech. In doing so, the court invalidated Section 203 of the Federal Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, also known as the McCain-Feingold Act for its sponsors Senator John McCain and Senator Russ Feingold, as well as Section 441B of the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, which was in 2002 amended. The court also overturned in whole or in part 2 previous Supreme Court rulings, Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce in 1990 and McConnell v. Federal Election Commission in 2003. So the Britannica site goes on to say, immediately perceived as historically important, the decision generated intense controversy outside the court. Some hailed it as a resounding victory for freedom of speech, while others criticized it as an overreaching attempt to rewrite campaign finance law. Among the critics was President Barack Obama, who remarked in his State of the Union address in the House of Representatives 1 week later that the decision would, quote, open the floodgates of special interests to spend without limit in our elections, end quote. His criticism provoked one of the Supreme Court justices in attendance, Samuel A. Alito, to break decorum by mouthing the words, not true. Now, I think any of us in our right minds who follow politics at all and how politicians are funded either by millionaires and billionaires and or through lobbyists who make contributions and sway them to vote in certain ways, particularly organizations like the National Rifle Association, which was proven a few years ago to actually write some of the legislation for the pro-gun legislators that they promised to back, that Samuel Alito was wrong and President Barack Obama was correct. So this brings us, on the topic of the Supreme Court, to the unexpected announcement also this past week on November 13th, the same day as the Scorpio new moon opposite Uranus, and this is from the New York Times that day. The Supreme Court announces ethics code for justices. The decision comes after revelations, the Times says, about undisclosed property deals and gifts have intensified pressure on the court to adopt such a code, end quote. But this code contains no mechanism for enforcement and appears on the surface to be akin to a fairly superficial press release. Those are my words. We'll see what happens, maybe when Mercury retrogrades back into Capricorn and then Sagittarius, which will happen between December 23rd and January of this year and January 1st of 2024. Now, I used to be a business journalist, so when I talk about a superficial press release, I'm not kidding, because, you cut your teeth when you're a little cub reporter, regardless of who you're working for, by getting press releases and having to rewrite them. And a lot of the press releases go into the garbage can because they have nothing but superficial BS in them. There's no news in them, in other words. Press release should have contained some kind of news that your publication wants to, to announce to its audience. Now, there's several other seemingly sudden and potentially shocking announcements that were made yesterday, both since as this Scorpio new moon lunar phase is waxing and leading up to today's Mars-Sun in Scorpio conjunction, and that is that the House Ethics Committee found yesterday, November 16th, quote, substantial evidence that Representative George Santos, who is the New York representative, who was already, they already voted not to expel him from the Congress recently, but the Ethics Committee has now released its report saying that he violated federal law, setting the stage for another push to expel the embattled first-term Republican from New York and prompting him to declare that he would not seek re-election. I'm sorry, this is from the New York Times yesterday. House investigators found evidence that Mr. Santos used campaign funds for personal purposes, defrauded donors, and filed false or incomplete campaign finance and financial disclosure reports, according to a 56-page report released on Thursday. It continues, the panel voted unanimously to refer its findings to the Department of Justice, saying that Mr. Santos' conduct, quote, warrants public condemnation, is beneath the dignity of the office, and has brought severe discredit upon the House. How's that for Mercury and Sadge? And while the panel refrained from recommending any punitive measures, there were already indications that the report could be the catalyst for a third effort to remove Mr. Santos from office. Numerous House members have previously said that they would support his expulsion if the committee found criminal wrongdoing or a severe breach of ethics. So let's remember that the House voted on expelling him, but they chose not to. Primarily, if we're smart, we may realize because they have such a slim majority, and getting rid of George Santos's vote on the Republican side would hurt them more than would doing the morally just thing. Now, the other thing is that the United Auto Workers ratified their contract at General Motors just yesterday, and that we have a tentative deal to free dozens of hostages, that word again, pending Israeli approval. But I was listening to a report by NPR News, which likened the process of hostage negotiations, and these are my words, not theirs, to a kind of game of telephone, because they have to communicate with Hamas through the nation of Qatar, and then they talk to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians talk to the Americans, and the Americans, I'm not even sure that's the whole thing, but it goes through several different parties and then has to get back. So this is kind of a half quote from NPR News. Up to 100 individuals, including dual citizens of Israel and other nations, agricultural laborers, many of whom were kidnapped and taken hostage from the border kibbutzes in Israel on the Israeli side of the Gazan border, women and children, but probably not IDF Israeli defense soldiers, either male or female, would be exchanged or released in exchange for Hamas wanting a 5-day ceasefire. But Israel says they would contemplate a 3-day maximum ceasefire, which is still meeting some opposition on the right-wing Israeli government side. But the deal is contingent upon the release of the same amount of Palestinian women and children in Israeli jails. And that release would be through the southern border of Gaza into into Egypt, and more than likely, as is mentioned, be acceptable only if it's a one-on-one exchange. So if it's 100 hostages, it's 100 people released, women and children, most of which I believe, though I don't know for sure, are teenagers who are held in Israeli prisons. So when the Scorpio sun sextiles Pluto on November 20th and Mercury in Sagittarius trines wounded healer Chiron in Aries, followed by Mars sextile to Pluto on November 21st, all potentially easy aspects of opportunity, we may see this prove to be true by the time the sun enters optimistic, expansive, freedom and travel-loving Jupiter-ruled Sagittarius on November 22nd next week. But glitches are always possible, since Venus will oppose Chiron November 22nd as well, and the sun newly in Sagittarius will square Saturn in Pisces, representing a potential blockage on November 23rd. But Mercury then quincunxes Uranus November 24th, so we might expect some unexpected news. The joke about Uranus transits is that you have to expect the unexpected, and if it's something you expect, it won't happen, right? So we don't know, but there may be some unexpected news or announcements. While Mars that day enters faster moving Sagittarius then too. So it's hard to say whether an agreement might be made to release hostages, but then that agreement withdrawn or put on hold or withheld or, some kind of snafu, but then potentially reconsidered. Though when Mars squares Saturn on November 25th, there's bound to be a resulting amount of frustration. So, as always, we shall see. And the other big piece of news yesterday with all this going on is that a San Francisco jury found guilty the man who attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, with a hammer in his home, causing a skull fracture. He will be sentenced in a little while, but and I think he could receive, I heard, up to 50 years or something for this crime. But with all this stuff going on, I want to mention something else that Rachel Maddow said recently in one of her podcasts or shows on TV, which is that when she looks at the current situation historically, because she just released that book about the fascist history of, well, the history of fascists infiltrating the United States Congress and other institutions in Washington, that she was saying that most of it was stopped by institutions themselves. So I'll use an example that she did not, although she was talking about the Catholic priest, I don't remember his first name, might be George Coughlin, who back in the 50s or maybe even I don't know if he was in the 30s and 40s, fascistically inclined, but the church themselves ousted him, or they defrocked him, or they demoted him. I think they demoted him. So in other words, she was making the point that at what point does it get to such craziness or insanity or, nuttiness or whatever you want to call it, delusional thinking or conspiracy theorists? Does the institution that the person who is making all these crazy claims or making these crazy stances, like Trump right now, at what point will the institution stand up to that person and knock them down a few pegs? Her point, of course, was to say that it looks unlikely right now that this will come from the Republican Party. So it has to come from somewhere else, where people like Trump and his underlings, let's just say, what groups are they part of, where the group will oust them. And that sounds very interesting to me, given the fact that soon we'll be seeing, soon enough, but again, going back and forth in this next year period, with Pluto going back into Aquarius in January, and then coming back to Capricorn, and then going back to Aquarius for a large part of 2024, which is group or transformations to groups, right? That's one of the ways to put it very simply. So which ones will, I guess, with Pluto tipping its foot into Aquarius now and then later in 2024, it's like, what groups will stand up to the quote-unquote crazy ideology of one of its members that opposes its own ideology? And the church is a good example, right? Because, if you look at the basic tenets of helping your neighbor and not killing your your enemy, and blah blah blah, not committing adultery, and all the 12 commandments, etc., right? You look at all of that and you say, oh, well, someone who violated that, how can they be a leader in the church? We might need to get rid of them, knock them down a peg, kick them out, or whatever, censor them at least, right? Which is what she said happened in back when to this Father Coughlin. So anyway, I'm out of time. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime, and to ask you to please be sure to join me next week on November 24th for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of